He didn't know I owned the company he'd been trying to impress for years. The look on his face when his boss introduced me as the CEO was worth every moment of listening to his condescension about his boring housewife. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this incredible journey. If you're enjoying these stories of unexpected empowerment, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us build this amazing community. Let's dive in. "So, what exactly do you do all day?" asked Vince, my husband Derek's colleague, his voice dripping with barely concealed condescension. The question hung in the air of our elegantly decorated patio as Derek's coworkers waited for my response. It was the annual summer barbecue I'd spent 3 days preparing for, the one Derek insisted would help him network his way to the top at Meridian Innovations. I felt 5 pairs of eyes on me, all men in nearly identical button-downs and khakis, all holding the craft beers I'd specially ordered from a local brewery Derek had once mentioned in passing, the same brewery whose distribution deal I'd anonymously approved through Meridian's acquisition team last quarter. Derek jumped in before I could answer. "Oh, Ellie just takes care of the house," he chuckled, exchanging knowing glances with his colleagues. "She tried the corporate world for a bit after college, but it wasn't for her. Some people just aren't cut out for the pressure, you know." I took a small sip of my lemonade, the same lemonade I'd made from scratch that morning, and maintained my practiced smile. The same smile I'd perfected over 3 years of marriage to a man who had no idea who I really was. "I keep busy, I replied softly, playing my part perfectly. "She's got her book clubs and her gardening," Derek continued as if I hadn't spoken, his tone suggesting these were activities barely worth mentioning. "The simple life, right, honey?" His friends laughed, their designer watches glinting in the afternoon sun. Watches quite similar to the one I'd given Derek for his birthday last month. A watch he believed he'd earned through his hard work at Meridian, never questioning how we afforded it on just his mid-level management salary. "Speaking of simple," said Marcus, Derek's department head, "did you read that proposal from the tech team? Complete amateur hour. Some people should stick to their lanes." What Marcus didn't know was that I'd personally designed the framework of that proposal through encrypted emails with the tech team's most junior member, an overlooked woman with brilliant ideas who'd been systematically ignored by Marcus and his boys' club. "Absolutely brutal," Derek agreed, puffing up his chest. "I sent them a complete rewrite this morning. Showed them how real business is done." I bit my tongue, knowing his rewrite had already been flagged in my private dashboard for its glaring security oversights and inflated cost projections. "Hey, Derek tells us you two met at some charity thing?" asked Jason, another Meridian executive, who'd spent the past fiscal year quietly padding his expense reports, a fact documented in the audit files only I and 2 trusted board members had access to. "Art gallery opening," I corrected gently. I was volunteering, and Derek was there representing Meridian. What I didn't mention was that I'd been studying Meridian's corporate culture for months before orchestrating that chance meeting. After watching my father's small tech startup get crushed by predatory corporate practices, I'd built Meridian from the ground up with a vision of ethical innovation. But over the years, operating only through intermediaries had left me out of touch with the day-to-day reality. I needed to understand how my company functioned from the inside, not as the owner, but as someone invisible to the power structure, someone they wouldn't guard themselves around. "Volunteering," Marcus smirked, emphasizing the word like it was a punchline. "That's cute. My wife tried that too before the twins. Now she's too busy spending my bonuses to have hobbies." The men laughed again, while I silently calculated exactly how much of Marcus's last bonus had come directly from my profit-sharing initiative, the one he'd fought against in board meetings, not knowing whose idea it had been. "Ellie's got quite the eye for detail," Derek said, gesturing vaguely toward our home. "You should see her little spreadsheets for the household budget, color-coded and everything." Little did he know those little spreadsheets had helped me track the efficiency metrics of every department at Meridian. identifying the systematic biases that had crept into hiring and promotion practices under the current leadership. Women. And their crafts, Vince said with a dismissive wave. My girlfriend's always making these scrapbooks. I don't have the heart to tell her nobody's going to look at that stuff. He's going to look. If only they knew that tomorrow morning, in exactly 14 hours, Derek's boss would be introducing me to the entire company as Elena Chambers, the reclusive founder and majority shareholder of Meridian Innovations, who had decided to step into the role of active CEO after years of working through proxies and board representatives. Oh, before I forget, said Derek, pulling out his phone, we should talk about the Palmer acquisition. I've got some thoughts on how we should structure the deal. I refilled their drinks, noting how Derek emphasized we, as if he had any real decision-making power in the acquisition process. The Palmer deal had been my project for the past 6 months, meticulously structured to ensure their groundbreaking environmental technology wouldn't be buried by short-term profit considerations, something Derek and his colleagues had repeatedly advocated for in their internal memos. I told Richardson we need to gut their R&D department, Derek continued, referring to Meridian's current CEO, a man who, unbeknownst to Derek, had been coordinating my transition into the active CEO role for weeks. Those environmental initiatives are a money pit. The others nodded in agreement, completely unaware that those money pit initiatives were the entire reason I'd pursued the acquisition. More coleslaw, gentlemen? I offered, playing the perfect hostess while mentally finalizing their performance. Reviews. If only they knew that their project pitches, their dismissive comments about female employees, their expense reports. I'd seen them all. And what I'd seen had convinced me it was time for a major restructuring, starting at the top. Thanks, Ellie, Marcus said, not even looking at me as he served himself. You know, Derek, you're lucky. No career ambitions, no constant pressure to climb the ladder. Just happy with the simple things. I smiled and began clearing the empty plates, listening as they discussed their brilliant strategies for the upcoming fiscal year. Strategies I had already rejected through my representatives on the board. Last week, as the evening sun cast long shadows across our patio, I caught Derek's eye and saw nothing but patronizing affection there. He had no idea that in less than a day, his world would be turned upside down. The irony was almost too delicious to bear. After our guests finally departed, leaving behind empty beer bottles and half-eaten plates of food, Derek slouched onto the patio sofa, loosening his belt. That went well, he said, scrolling through his phone. Marcus was impressed with the house, definitely moving up in his books. I nodded absently while clearing the last of the dishes, mentally reviewing the secure messages I needed to send before tomorrow's revelation. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp, followed by the company-wide announcement at 10:30. Everything had been meticulously planned down to the minute. You should have heard what Marcus said when you were in the kitchen, Derek continued, not looking up from his screen. Said I scored big time with a wife who knows her place. No career drama, no competing priorities. Is that so? I kept my voice neutral, though I made a mental note to add this to Marcus's growing file. Exactly. That's why we work so well together, Ellie. You understand what's important. Derek finally looked up. Which reminds me, I need that blue Brooks Brothers shirt pressed for tomorrow. Big presentation to the executive team. Little did he know there would be no presentation tomorrow, at least not the one he had planned. I'll take care of it, I replied, already planning which outfit I would wear for my own, much more significant presentation. After Derek fell asleep that night, I slipped into our home office, the room he rarely entered, dismissing it as my craft space. Behind the tasteful bookshelves and beneath the framed watercolors I'd painted myself, another cute hobby he indulged, lay the command center from which I'd built and run Meridian Innovations for the past decade. A hidden panel in the wall slid open silently, revealing 3 state-of-the-art monitors and a secure workstation. Within moments, I was connected to Meridian's most protected servers, reviewing the final details for tomorrow's transition. My journey to this moment had begun 12 years ago, when I was fresh out of business school with nothing but a revolutionary software idea and the bitter memory of watching my father's technology startup get devoured by corporate predators. Dad had been brilliant. An engineer ahead of his time who developed predictive algorithms that could have transformed supply chain management across industries. But he was too trusting, too focused on the technology to see the corporate sharks circling. When Globotech acquired his company, they buried his innovations, terminated his team, and squeezed him out with legal maneuvers he couldn't afford to fight. He died a year later, officially from heart failure, but I knew it was a broken heart that truly killed him. I vowed then that I would build something he would have been proud of, a company that valued innovation over short-term profits, that treated employees as assets rather than expendable resources. Most importantly, I would protect it from becoming the very monster that had destroyed him. Meridian Innovations rose from the ashes of my father's dreams. I secured initial funding through a series of female investors who believed in my vision of ethical technology development. My first breakthrough came with developing my father's abandoned algorithms into what became Meridian Flow, now the industry standard in predictive resource management. But I'd learned from my father's mistakes. I kept my involvement carefully guarded, operating through a series of proxies and shell companies. On paper, Meridian was founded by EC Holdings, a private investment firm that traced back through so many layers of legitimate businesses that even the most determined investigator would struggle to find me. For public appearances, I hired Richardson to be the face of Meridian, a seasoned executive nearing retirement who was happy to follow my directives while taking credit for our successes. The arrangement worked perfectly. I maintained control while observing the business world from a position of invisibility. A notification pinged on my screen. It was a message from Vanessa, my most trusted executive, and one of only 3 people, at Meridian, who knew my true identity. Final preparations complete. Board members briefed. Security protocols in place. Ready when you are, Elena. I smiled, thinking of Vanessa. Brilliant. Overlooked by Derek and his colleagues because she didn't play golf or drink scotch with them after hours. They had no idea she reported directly to me, documenting every instance of their boys' club mentality and policy sabotage. I replied simply, "Confirmed for 9 a.m. Send the car at 8:15. My fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, accessing the secure files we'd been compiling for months. Every dismissive email about female employees' ideas. Every inflated expense report. Every instance where Derek and his cohort had undermined company policies on sustainability and ethics. All meticulously documented, time-stamped, and backed, up on servers only I could access. The evidence was overwhelming, not just of personal disrespect, but of systematic dismantling of the very values Meridian had been built upon. Tomorrow would change everything. As I closed the secure workstation and watched the wall panel slide back into place, I reflected on how I'd ended up marrying Derek in the first place. It had been calculated, yes, but not entirely cold. 3. Years ago, Meridian had been experiencing troubling cultural shifts despite its financial success. Reports from mid-level managers suggested a growing disconnect between our stated values and daily operations. I needed to understand the problem firsthand, but couldn't do so as the mysterious owner. The art gallery opening had been the perfect opportunity. As a major donor, I ensured Meridian would send representatives, then positioned myself as a volunteer, just another face in the crowd, approachable and unthreatening. Derek had been charming that night, attentive in a way that seemed genuine. He spoke passionately about Meridian's work, expressing admiration for a company that put innovation first. I was almost convinced he shared my values. Our courtship was swift. I presented myself as Elena Mitchell, a former marketing coordinator who'd left the corporate world to pursue more meaningful work. Derek found this charming, even admirable in a patronizing way. "Not everyone is cut out for the rat race," he'd said on our third date, patting my hand sympathetically. I married him 6 months later, taking his last name of Collins while maintaining my legal identity as Elena Chambers for Meridian Business. The perfect cover, hiding in plain sight as the supportive wife of a mid-level executive, all while gathering the intelligence I needed about my company's cultural deterioration. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly Derek's charming attentiveness would transform into condescension once he had the wife he wanted. The man who had seemed impressed by my volunteer work now dismissed it as cute. The man who had listened to my thoughts now interrupted me mid-sentence. Most revealing were the glimpses into how he and his colleagues operated at Meridian when they thought no one important was watching. The casual discrimination, the undermined initiatives, the credit stealing, all of it documented through my hidden observation and Vanessa's strategic positioning within the company. I checked the time, 1:17 a.m. In less than 8 hours, everything would change. I closed down my systems and slipped back into bed beside Derek, who was snoring softly, blissfully unaware of what awaited him. For a moment, looking at his peaceful face, I felt a twinge of, not regret exactly, but acknowledgement of what might have been if he'd truly been the man he'd presented himself as when we met. If he'd respected me as an equal rather than seeing me as an accessory to his life. But that moment passed quickly. Tomorrow wasn't about personal revenge, it was about restoring Meridian to its founding principles. Derek and his colleagues had had every opportunity to embody the values we claimed to stand for. Instead, they'd chosen arrogance, discrimination, and short-sighted profit-chasing. As I drifted toward sleep, I mentally reviewed my wardrobe choices for tomorrow. Not the expected floral dress or casual slacks of a housewife attending a spouse's work function, but the tailored Armani suit hanging in the back of my closet, the one Derek had never seen, never questioned. CEO attire, awaiting its moment. Tomorrow, Elena Collins, boring housewife, would disappear. In her place would stand Elena Chambers, founder and CEO of Meridian Innovations, ready to reclaim her company. The thought brought a small smile to my face as I fell asleep, dreaming of boardrooms, restructuring plans, and the look that would soon appear on Derek's face when he realized who he'd been married to all along. Morning arrived with the precision of a well-orchestrated plan. I'd been awake since 5 a.m., carefully preparing for the day that would change everything while maintaining the appearance of my usual routine. Derek found me in the kitchen, as he always did, preparing his favorite breakfast, a protein-rich meal I'd read was optimal for cognitive function. Ironic, considering how much clear thinking he would need today. "Big day," he said, adjusting his tie, the one I'd selected for him last night, knowing its blue tone would perfectly complement the outfit I planned to wear. Another small private satisfaction. "Oh?" I feigned ignorance as I poured his coffee. "The presentation?" "Richardson called an all-hands meeting this morning. Rumor has it there's a major announcement coming." Derek buttered his toast, oblivious to how major it truly was. "Probably that Palmer acquisition finally going through." "That sounds important," I said, hiding my smile behind my tea mug. "Will spouses be welcome at this meeting?" Derek laughed, nearly choking on his coffee. "God, no. What would you do at a corporate meeting? Besides, it'll be boring as hell. All stock projections and transition planning." "I suppose you're right," I conceded, mentally reviewing the precise, decidedly not boring announcement Richardson would be making in a few hours. "Actually," Derek said, checking his watch, "I should head in early. Want to catch Marcus before the meeting, make sure we're aligned on the Smith contract." The Smith contract. Another of Derek's projects that I'd been quietly monitoring. One, where he'd proposed cutting corners on cybersecurity measures to reduce costs, despite my clear company-wide directive prioritizing data protection. "Of course," I smiled, playing my part one last time. Don't forget your presentation notes. He grabbed the folder I'd placed on the counter, not realizing I'd reviewed his presentation last night and found 3 critical flaws in his market analysis, flaws that would never be exposed now given today's impending changes. Thanks, babe. Don't wait up tonight. We'll probably hit Sullivan's after work to celebrate the announcement. Sullivan's, where Derek and his colleagues routinely ran up excessive tabs on the company expense account, another item in my growing evidence file. Have fun, I said, kissing his cheek. As the front door closed behind him, I exhaled slowly, setting down my teacup with deliberate care. Then I moved with purpose, the pretense falling away with each step toward my bedroom. The patience I'd exercised over the past 3 years had been calculated and necessary, if occasionally maddening. Each dismissive comment about my little hobbies, each interruption when I spoke, each condescending explanation of basic concepts I'd mastered years ago, all absorbed and cataloged, not just for personal vindication, but as evidence of a broader problem at Meridian. In my closet, I pushed aside the cardigans and casual dresses Derek was accustomed to seeing me in, revealing the hidden section where my real wardrobe waited. I selected the charcoal Armani suit, crisp white blouse, and the tie. Subtle sapphire earrings that had been my mother's, my talisman for important days. As I dressed, I thought about the first board meeting I'd ever attended virtually as Meridian's anonymous founder. I'd been 28, speaking through voice-modulating software while my ideas were debated by men twice my age. Even then, I'd understood that revealing my identity, my age, my gender, would have changed how my vision was received. That initial decision to remain anonymous had evolved over time into a comprehensive strategy. EC Holdings developed a reputation for brilliant but reclusive leadership. Investors and partners respected the privacy, especially once our returns consistently outperformed industry averages. My absence became its own kind of mystique. What began as protection became a powerful observation post. I watched competitors underestimate us without a charismatic founder to target. I saw how employees behaved when they weren't performing for the boss. Most importantly, I witnessed how my own management team operated when they thought no one was looking. My phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. "Car waiting whenever you're ready," Richardson briefed and positioned. I responded quickly. "On my way. Status of target subjects?" Her reply came moments later. "All arrived. DR in." Side meeting with MP and VL. Completely unaware. Derek, Marcus, and Vince huddled together, likely strategizing how to position themselves advantageously after what they assumed would be an acquisition announcement. The thought almost made me smile. I took one final look in the mirror. The vow. Woman staring back bore little resemblance to Ellie Collins, Derek's unambitious housewife. My posture was different, straight-backed and commanding. My expression was focused and resolute. Even my voice, when I practiced my opening statement one last time, carried an authority I'd carefully concealed for 3 years of marriage. Good. Morning. I'm Elena Chambers, founder and CEO of Meridian Innovations. Perfect. The sleek company car waited at the curb, deliberately different from the vehicle that had picked up Derek earlier. My driver, Thomas, had been with me since Meridian's founding days, one of the few who knew my true identity. "The usual entrance, Ms. Chambers?" he asked as we pulled away from the house. "No, Thomas. Today we use the front door." He nodded, understanding the significance. For years, my rare visits to Meridian headquarters had been conducted through private entrances, at odd hours, with carefully limited exposure. Today would be different in every way. During the drive, I reviewed the key points of my presentation on my tablet: the company-wide restructuring, the refocused priorities on ethical innovation and inclusive workplace practices, the specific personnel changes that would send shockwaves through the executive floor. I'd been preparing this transition for over a year, meticulously documenting the cultural erosion that had infected Meridian despite its financial success. What had begun as an observational exercise through my marriage to Derek had evolved into a comprehensive case for intervention. The evidence was damning. Senior male executives routinely took credit for work done by female colleagues. Environmental initiatives were undermined by the very people tasked with implementing them. Unconscious bias in hiring and promotion had created entire departments lacking in diversity of thought or background. And at the center of it all was the leadership culture embodied by men like Derek, Marcus, and Vince. Men who spoke passionately about Meridian's values in official communications while mocking those same principles in private. "We've arrived, Ms. Chambers," Thomas announced, pulling up to the main entrance of Meridian's headquarters, a sleek glass building I'd helped design but had never entered through the front door. "Thank you, Thomas." I gathered my things, centering myself for what was to come. "Please wait here. This shouldn't take more than a few hours." The security guard at the front desk did a double take as I approached. Not recognition, but surprise at an unfamiliar executive entering without the usual credentials. "Good morning," I said, offering a small smile. "I'm Elena Chambers. I believe Mr. Richardson is expecting me." The guard's eyes widened slightly. Richardson's briefing had clearly included my name, if not my full identity. "Yes, Ms. Chambers. Mr. Richardson asked that you be escorted directly to the executive conference room." He picked up his phone, summoning an assistant. Within moments, a young woman appeared, clearly briefed on the importance of her assignment, though uncertain of exactly who I was. "Ms. Chambers? I'm Zoe. Mr. Richardson asked me to escort you personally." As we walked through the main atrium, I observed my company with new eyes. The innovative architecture I'd insisted on, designed to encourage collaboration and transparency, now housed departments segregated by invisible but rigid hierarchies. The values inscribed on the feature wall, innovation, integrity, inclusion, seemed to mock the reality I'd documented over the past 3 years. "Is this your first time visiting Meridian?" Zoe asked conversationally as we entered the elevator, in a manner of speaking, I replied, watching her puzzled expression in the mirrored wall. The executive floor was buzzing with anticipation when we arrived. Through glass walls, I could see board members assembling in the main conference room, while various department heads hovered nearby, sensing the importance of whatever announcement was coming. And there, in a smaller meeting room across the hall, sat Derek, Marcus, and Vince, heads together, completely unaware that their world was about to change. Derek glanced up briefly as I passed, his eyes sliding over me without recognition. In his mind, Ellie existed in a completely different context, the home setting where he'd placed and defined me. Here, in his professional domain, I was invisible. To him, even in plain sight. That was about to change. Zoe led me to a private office adjacent to the conference room, where Richardson waited. At 62, with silver hair and the polished demeanor of a seasoned executive, he'd played his role perfectly as Meridian's public-facing CEO. Only his eyes reflected recognition as I entered, the respect of someone who had worked with me, for years though rarely in person. "Ms. Chambers," he said formally, extending his hand. "It's an honor to finally introduce you to the company." "Thank you, David," I replied, accepting the handshake. "Is everything prepared as discussed?" He nodded, handing me a tablet with the finalized agenda. "The board is assembled. Senior leadership will join in 5 minutes. The company-wide live stream begins at 10:30 sharp." I reviewed the agenda quickly, noting with satisfaction that everything was exactly as I'd specified. "And our subjects of interest?" Richardson's professional demeanor cracked slightly with a small smile. "Still completely unaware. Mr. Collins actually asked me this morning if he could add a brief segment to the announcement. Something about the marketing implications of the Palmer acquisition." "How thoughtful of him," I said dryly. "I'm sure We can accommodate that request, just not in the way he's expecting." A light knock at the door announced Vanessa's arrival. Unlike Richardson, who had maintained a professional distance despite our years of collaboration, Vanessa greeted me with the warmth of genuine partnership. "The moment has finally arrived," she said, her eyes bright with anticipation. As my chief operations officer, a title known to only a handful of people, she had been instrumental in documenting the cultural issues while implementing what positive changes she could from her official position as a senior project manager. "Indeed, it has," I agreed, feeling a calm settle over me, the tranquility that comes with absolute certainty. "Shall we proceed?" Richardson nodded to his assistant, who opened the door to the main conference room. As I stepped forward, I left behind 3 years of strategic patience, of calculated underestimation, of watching and waiting for precisely this moment. The time for observation was over. The time for action had arrived. I hadn't always planned to reveal myself as Meridian's founder. For the first year of my marriage to Derek, my anonymous oversight had seemed sufficient. I'd been content to guide the company from afar while using my position as an executive's wife to observe our corporate culture through a different lens. But 6 months ago, everything changed at the annual Meridian Holiday Gala. The event was held at the Grand Meridian Hotel, a venue I'd selected years earlier for its accessibility and central location. Derek had complained about it every year, preferring the exclusive country club on the city outskirts, despite its poor public transportation access that effectively excluded employees without cars. "Ready for another thrilling evening of corporate small talk?" Derek had asked as we dressed for the event, his tone making it clear he found nothing thrilling about including employees below the executive level. I'd chosen a simple but elegant black dress, understated enough not to draw attention, yet appropriate for an executive's wife. As always, I wore my mother's sapphire earrings, my one personal indulgence and connection to my past. "I enjoy meeting the people you work with," I'd replied honestly. "These events were my most valuable intelligence-gathering opportunities." Derek had laughed. "You just like the free champagne and dessert bar." At the gala, I'd circulated carefully, introducing myself as Ellie Collins, Derek's wife, to employees who might not recognize me from previous events. The reactions were always telling. Some treated me with genuine warmth, others with the particular brand of condescension reserved for someone they deemed irrelevant to their advancement. The evening progressed as expected until I overheard a conversation that would ultimately set tonight's revelation in motion. I'd been standing near a cocktail table, engaged in conversation with the wife of another executive, when Derek's voice carried from a nearby group huddled around high-top tables. "That's the problem with the diversity initiative," he was saying to Marcus, Vince, and several other senior managers. "We're being forced to interview candidates who are clearly unqualified just to check some HR box." I'd tensed, recognizing the initiative he was dismissing, one I'd personally designed to address our growing homogeneity problem. "Tell me about it," Marcus had replied, lowering his voice, but not enough. "That woman Richardson wants for the tech director position?" Completely out of her depth. "But she ticks 2 diversity boxes, so we have to seriously consider her." The woman in question was Dr. Ananya Patel, a brilliant engineer with 3 patents to her name and a track record of successful innovation at a smaller competitor. I'd personally flagged her application for Richardson after seeing her work at an industry conference. "Just delegate her to some CSR project if she gets hired," Vince had suggested. Something with community or sustainability in the title. They love that meaningless stuff. Corporate social responsibility, a core component of Meridian's founding mission that I'd written into our charter. Meaningless stuff. "Speaking of unqualified women," Derek had continued, his voice slightly slurred from one too many scotches. "You should have seen Ellie trying to make suggestions about my presentation last week. Started talking about market integration like she has any idea what that even means." The memory made me flush even now. I had indeed offered suggestions on his presentation, subtle corrections to his misinterpretation of market data that would have embarrassed him in front of the board. "That's wives for you," another executive had chuckled. "Mine tried explaining cryptocurrency to me last month, after watching some Netflix documentary." "At least Ellie knows her place most of the time," Derek had said, and the casual cruelty in his tone had cut through me like glass. When I first met her, she had all these opinions about corporate ethics and sustainability. Now she just handles the household and stays in her lane. The others had laughed, and Derek had continued, emboldened by their response. "Makes life easier. Can you imagine being married to one of those career-obsessed types? No thanks. I need my home to be my refuge, not another boardroom." I'd excused myself from my conversation, needing space to process what I'd heard. In the elegant bathroom of the Grand Meridian, I'd stared at my reflection, seeing for the first time how completely Derek had misunderstood, or chosen to misunderstand, my identity. It wasn't just that he'd dismissed my intelligence or misrepresented our relationship. It was the realization that his attitude reflected a systemic problem at Meridian, one that my anonymous leadership had failed to correct. That night marked the beginning of my documentation project. No longer content to merely observe, I began systematically gathering evidence of how Derek and his colleagues were undermining Meridian's core values. Over the next 6 months, the evidence mounted at an alarming rate. There was the diversity committee meeting where Derek and Marcus had maneuvered to appoint themselves as allies, then used their positions to slow-walk every meaningful initiative. "We need to be thoughtful about implementation timelines," Derek had insisted in an email I accessed through my secure channels. "Moving too quickly on diversity quotas could compromise our meritocratic culture." The irony of his concern for merit was particularly rich given what I observed at the quarterly review session 2 months later. Sarah Chen, one of our most promising product managers, had presented a market analysis that clearly outlined an opportunity to expand our sustainability software into new industries. Her research was impeccable, her presentation polished and data-driven. "Interesting perspective, Sarah," Derek had said when she finished, his tone making clear it was anything. But I think you're missing the larger market dynamics at play." He'd then proceeded to present almost identical recommendations as his own insights at the executive committee meeting the following week, with no credit to Sarah's work. When the initiative succeeded, Derek received the accolades and Sarah received nothing but a standard performance review noting she was meeting expectations. But the incident that finally cemented my decision to step out of the shadows occurred just 3 weeks ago at our home. Derek had invited Marcus and Vince over for what he called a strategy session to prepare for the Palmer acquisition. I'd served drinks and appetizers before excusing myself, then monitored their conversation through the security system I'd installed throughout our home. "The problem with this Palmer deal is all the environmental baggage," Marcus had complained. Reviewing documents spread across our dining room table. "Their entire business model is built around sustainability metrics." "Richardson is obsessed with this green technology angle," Derek had agreed. "But there's a way around it." What followed was a detailed discussion of how they plan to acquire Palmer Technologies primarily for its client list and proprietary software, while quietly shelving its groundbreaking environmental monitoring tools, the very innovation that had made Palmer a target for acquisition in the first place. "We'll maintain the sustainability messaging for PR purposes," Derek had explained, "but reallocate most of the R&D resources to more commercially viable products." "What about the Palmer team?" Vince had asked. "They're true believers in this environmental mission." Derek's response had chilled me. "We'll keep a skeleton crew for appearances, maybe create a Center for Sustainability Innovation, or something equally meaningless. The rest will be transitioned out within 6 months. Standard acquisition playbook." They were planning to dismantle everything that made Palmer valuable beyond its immediate commercial assets, And they were doing it deliberately, systematically, while maintaining public messaging about Meridian's commitment to environmental innovation. That night, after they left, I made my decision. Anonymous oversight was no longer sufficient. The company I'd built was being corrupted from within by the very executives entrusted to uphold its values. The culture had shifted so dramatically that they felt comfortable planning to undermine our core mission right in my home, with my husband leading the charge. The next morning, I'd contacted Richardson and Vanessa to begin preparations for my public emergence as Meridian's founder and CEO. As I documented each incident, each email, each misalignment between our stated values and actual practices, I found myself reflecting on what had drawn me to Derek in the first place. Had there been genuine potential there? Had I seen something worthy in him? Or had I been so focused on my observation project that I'd overlooked fundamental character flaws? There had been moments, early in our relationship, when Derek had spoken passionately about building technologies that made a positive difference. He'd expressed admiration for Meridian's ethical stance and commitment to inclusive innovation. Had that all been performance? Or had something changed him? The culture of executive privilege, perhaps? Or the influence of men like Marcus and Vince who measured success solely by profit margins and personal advancement? In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the pattern of disrespect extended far beyond his treatment of me. It had infected how he and his colleagues treated female employees, environmental initiatives, diversity efforts, everything that Meridian had been founded to champion. The tipping point came last week when I discovered that Derek and his team had created a shadow implementation plan for the Palmer acquisition, one that directly contradicted the integration strategy approved by the board. Their version accelerated the dismantling of Palmer's environmental technology division and reallocated resources to more immediately profitable product lines. That discovery had triggered my final preparations. The board was quietly briefed. Key personnel were strategically positioned. Documentation was finalized and secured. Now, as I prepared to enter the conference room where Meridian's leadership awaited, I reflected on how systematically Derek and his colleagues had undermined everything I'd built. Their casual dismissal of Ellie had been merely a symptom of a broader problem, one I was about to address definitively. The pattern of escalating disrespect had made one thing abundantly clear: Meridian needed its founder back. Not as a silent observer, but as an active, visible leader who would realign the company with its original mission. It was time to remind everyone what Meridian Innovations truly stood for and who had built it in the first place. In the weeks leading up to this moment, my home office had transformed from a casual workspace into a command center for what I privately termed Operation Reclamation. Every detail of today's revelation had been planned with precision that would have impressed even the most demanding project manager. The night after overhearing Derek's acquisition sabotage plan, I had initiated the final phase of preparations with a secure message to my most trusted inner circle: Richardson, Vanessa, and Meridian's general counsel, Josephine Rivera, one of the few executives who knew my true identity from the beginning. Code Phoenix authorized. Timeline: 3 weeks. Full documentation required. Their responses had been immediate and aligned. Years of contingency planning were activated with a single message. Josephine began the legal groundwork, ensuring that my emergence as Meridian's founder and CEO would proceed without complications. Employment contracts were reviewed, focusing particularly on the executive team's compliance requirements and termination clauses. Richardson started preparing the board, speaking individually with each member to smooth the transition. Though they knew Meridian had a founder who preferred anonymity, only 3 had ever interacted with me directly, albeit through encrypted channels. Their support would be crucial for what came next. Vanessa, meanwhile, became my eyes and ears within Meridian's daily operations, strategically positioning allies and documenting the activities of Derek and his inner circle with meticulous attention to detail. My own preparations were equally thorough. Each night after Derek fell asleep, I worked in my hidden office space, compiling evidence and refining strategy. My housewife schedule provided perfect cover. Derek never questioned my early bedtimes, assuming I simply had nothing important to stay up for. The documentation process was exhaustive. I created secure folders for each executive involved in undermining Meridian's values, with special attention to Derek, Marcus, and Vince as the primary architects of the cultural deterioration. Derek's folder was particularly damning. Emails where he dismissed female employees' contributions. Meeting. Recordings where he advocated for cutting ethical corners to increase profit margins. Performance reviews where he downgraded employees who championed sustainability initiatives too aggressively. Most significantly, I had the shadow implementation plan for Palmer Technologies, downloaded directly from his laptop during one of his golf outings, showing how he intended to dismantle the very innovations that had made Palmer valuable in the first place. For Marcus, I compiled evidence of his systematic blocking of diverse candidates for senior positions, including the spreadsheet he'd created to track what he called diversity hires versus merit hires, a distinction that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of our hiring philosophy. Vince's file contained extensive documentation of his creative accounting with the company expense account, his inappropriate comments to female team members, and his deliberate undermining of our environmental compliance standards. Beyond individual evidence, I assembled a comprehensive analysis of how Meridian's culture had shifted over the past 5 years. Diversity statistics showing a decline in both hiring and promotion of women and minorities at the executive level. Customer satisfaction data revealing growing concerns about our commitment to sustainability. Employee surveys showing decreasing confidence in leadership's alignment with stated company values. The pattern was clear and irrefutable. While Meridian remained financially successful, it was steadily betraying its foundational principles under the current executive leadership. Parallel to this documentation process, I had been preparing for my own transformation from Ellie Collins to Elena Chambers, CEO. This went beyond wardrobe choices or presentation rehearsals, though both were meticulously handled. It required a psychological shift, a deliberate reclamation of the identity I had partially suppressed during my years of marriage to Derek. 10 days before the planned revelation, I had visited a small boutique in another city, purchasing the Armani suit I would wear today. I'd had it tailored in yet another location, ensuring no connection could be made between Ellie Collins and these preparations. The suit waited in a locked garment bag in the back of my closet, a physical representation of the identity I would soon reclaim fully. 7 days before, I had met secretly with Richardson and Josephine at a private dining room in an out-of-the-way restaurant, finalizing the legal and logistical details of the transition. My appearance had been carefully disguised. Nothing dramatic, just enough. Alterations to ensure I wouldn't be recognized if seen with 2 Meridian executives. The board is prepared, Richardson had assured me. Initially surprised, of course, but ultimately supportive once I shared the preliminary evidence. And legally? I had asked Josephine. Airtight, she'd confirmed. Your founding documents and controlling interest were structured perfectly. There's no legal avenue for challenge, especially given the evidence of values misalignment and policy violations. 5 days before, Vanessa had delivered the final piece of damning evidence, an audio recording from an executive lunch where Derek, Marcus, and Vince had openly discussed their plans to gradually phase out Meridian's commitment to ethical technology development in favor of more aggressive, profit-centered strategies. The whole technology for good thing was fine for getting established, Derek had said, his voice clear on the recording. But we're beyond that now. Time to focus on shareholders, not social responsibility theater. The recording had been obtained legally. The restaurant was owned by Meridian as a corporate event space, with clear notices about recording for security purposes. Derek and his colleagues had been too arrogant to consider who might be listening. 3. Days before, I had conducted a detailed walkthrough of today's events with my core team. Timing was plotted down to 5-minute increments. Security protocols were established to manage potential disruptions. Communication strategies were finalized for both internal and external announcements. "What about Derek specifically?" Vanessa had asked during this meeting. "Given your personal connection," I had anticipated this question. "Derek will be handled exactly like the others, professionally and in accordance with company policy. Our personal relationship is irrelevant to his professional misconduct." 2 days before, I had carefully prepared my presentation materials, working with a trusted graphic designer who believed she was creating materials for a confidential board meeting. The slides were powerful in their simplicity, clear data visualizations showing the divergence between Meridian's stated values and its actions under current leadership, followed by a comprehensive restructuring plan to realign the company with its founding principles. 1 day before, yesterday, I had made final preparations at home, carefully selecting items from our shared space that held personal significance: family photos, my mother's small art collection, essential documents. These were discreetly transferred to a secure location, a necessary precaution given the likely fallout in my marriage. I had also prepared a letter for Derek, to be delivered after today's events. Not an apology. I had nothing to apologize for, but an explanation. Despite everything, we had shared 3 years of our lives. He deserved to understand what had happened, even if he would never accept or appreciate it. And finally, this morning, I had implemented the last elements of my preparation. A series of scheduled emails had been set to deliver at strategic times throughout the day. 4:45 a.m., a message to all Meridian employees announcing a company-wide broadcast at 10:30 a.m. 11 a.m. Press releases to key media outlets revealing Elena Chambers as Meridian's founder and new CEO, along with the broad strokes of the company's recommitment to its original values. a.m. Notifications to key clients and partners, with special attention to Palmer Technologies' leadership, assuring them of Meridian's commitment to ethical integration of their environmental innovations. p.m. A carefully crafted social media announcement, timed to coincide with the expected first wave of internal reactions. Each communication had been drafted, revised, and finalized weeks ago, awaiting only the trigger of today's events to be released into the world. Even my personal logistics had been managed with military precision. A new driver, not the one Derek was familiar with, had been arranged to bring me to Meridian headquarters. A security team was on standby at our home, ready to oversee the changing of locks and security codes. A separate team was positioned at Meridian to manage any potential disruptions during the announcement. My own exit strategy was equally detailed. Depending on Derek's reaction, which I had scenario planned extensively, I would either return briefly to our home to collect additional belongings or proceed directly to the apartment I had maintained under my legal name since before our marriage. Either way, by nightfall I would be formally separated from the man who had spent years underestimating me, both professionally and personally. As the car had approached Meridian headquarters this morning, I had reviewed this preparation one final time, mentally checking off each element of the plan. Nothing had been left to chance. Every contingency had been anticipated. Every detail had been managed. The preparation hadn't been merely thorough. It had been therapeutic. Each documented instance of disrespect, each carefully planned response, had helped me process the complex emotions of these past 3 years. The anger at being dismissed, the frustration of watching my company's values erode, the peculiar grief of realizing my marriage had been built on a foundation of misunderstanding, some deliberate on my part, but much of it stemming from Derek's refusal to see me as I truly was. This meticulous preparation had transformed those emotions into something productive, a clear-eyed determination to reclaim not just my company, but the principles that had driven me to create it in the first place. Now, standing outside the conference room where Meridian's leadership awaited an announcement they couldn't possibly anticipate, I felt a profound calm. The preparation was complete. The evidence was irrefutable. The path forward was clear. All that remained was the revelation itself. The executive conference room of Meridian Innovations fell silent as Richardson stood at the head of the table. The board members were already seated, their expressions revealing varying degrees of anticipation and curiosity. Senior executives lined the walls, including Derek, Marcus, and Vince, who had been summoned from their side meeting just moments before. "Thank you all for assembling on such short notice," Richardson began, his voice carrying the formal tone he reserved for significant announcements. "Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that today marks a historic transition for Meridian Innovations." Derek caught my eye from across the room, his brow furrowed in confusion. I had entered quietly and taken a seat near the door, a position that would have been natural for an assistant or junior team member, but unusual for a visitor of importance. His gaze slid past me without recognition, returning to Richardson, as he continued. "As many of you know, Meridian was founded 10 years ago by a visionary leader who chose to remain anonymous, guiding the company through representatives while maintaining a controlling interest through EC Holdings." Murmurs rippled through the room. Though this wasn't new information, the context suggested revelations to come. I noticed Derek leaning toward Marcus, whispering something that made them both smirk. Likely speculation about this mysterious founder. Speculation that had been a favorite topic among executives who assumed the anonymous owner was a reclusive tech billionaire or foreign investor. "Today," Richardson continued, "marks the end of that anonymity. After careful consultation with the board, the founder of Meridian Innovations has decided to step into a public leadership role as our new chief executive officer." The murmurs grew louder. Derek straightened in his chair, his expression shifting from casual interest to sharp attention. His career ambitions had always included becoming CEO once Richardson retired, a goal he'd spoken of often at home, unaware that the position had never been his to claim. Richardson paused, allowing the anticipation to build. His eyes met mine briefly, a silent confirmation that the moment had arrived. I rose from my seat, feeling the physical transformation that accompanied this shift in identity. My posture straightened, my chin lifted, my stride lengthened as I moved to the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richardson said, his voice clear and formal, "it is my honor to introduce Elena Chambers, founder of Meridian Innovations, and, effective immediately, our new chief executive officer." The room erupted in gasps and whispers. All eyes turned to me as I took my place beside Richardson. In the sea of shocked faces, I found Derek's, his expression frozen in disbelief, his complexion rapidly paling as recognition dawned. "Thank you, David," I said, my voice steady and authoritative, nothing like the softer tones I used as Ellie Collins. "I appreciate your leadership over these past years and your assistance in this transition." I turned to face the room, making deliberate eye contact with board members and executives alike. For those who don't know me, which is most of you, I am Elena Chambers. I founded Meridian Innovations 10 years ago with a vision of creating technology that serves humanity's best interests while operating on principles of integrity, inclusion, and environmental responsibility. My gaze landed briefly on Derek, who seemed unable to process what was happening. His mouth opened and closed without words, his eyes wide with shock. Beside him, Marcus and Vince looked equally stunned, exchanging glances of confusion and growing alarm. "Some of you," I continued, allowing a small smile, may be more familiar with me as Ellie Collins, wife of Derek Collins from our Strategic Partnerships division. The room went completely silent as the implications sank in. Derek's face transitioned from shock to horror as he realized that his boring housewife was actually the founder and controlling shareholder of the company he'd been trying to climb for years. This dual identity was not initially planned, I explained, addressing the unspoken questions hanging in the air. It evolved from my desire to understand Meridian's culture authentically, without the distortions that can occur when employees know they're speaking to the CEO. I clicked a remote, bringing the presentation screen to life with Meridian's original mission statement and core values. What I discovered through this unique perspective was concerning. A growing divergence between our stated principles and our actual practices. A cultural shift that has led us away from the foundational values that made Meridian revolutionary. Another click displayed a graph showing the declining metrics in diversity, environmental impact, and ethical compliance over the past 3 years, precisely the period during which Derek and his colleagues had gained influence. Today marks not just my public emergence as Meridian's founder, but a strategic realignment of our company with its original mission. This will involve significant organizational changes, which we'll discuss momentarily. I turned to Richardson, extending my hand. First, I want to thank David Richardson for his years of service as our public-facing CEO. David has been one of the few people aware of my identity from the beginning, and his leadership has been invaluable. Richardson shook my hand firmly, the formal acknowledgement of a leadership transition. It has been my privilege, Ms. Chambers. The use of my professional name rather than the diminutive Ellie that Derek and his colleagues were accustomed to. Hearing created another visible ripple of adjustment among the attendees. This was a physical representation of the power shift occurring. I was no longer the supportive wife hovering in the background, but the ultimate authority in the room. Before we proceed, I said, turning back to the assembled leadership, I want to address what I imagine is a significant shock for one person in particular. All eyes turned to Derek, who had recovered enough from his initial shock to look both angry and frightened, an expression I'd never seen on him before. Derek, I said, my voice professionally neutral. I understand this is unexpected. We'll have a private conversation later. For now, I ask that you participate in this meeting as you would any other leadership transition. His face flushed dark red, a storm of emotions playing across features I had known intimately for years. For a moment, I thought he might speak, might create a scene that would only make this more difficult for him. But years of corporate training held. He gave a tight nod, his jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle twitching in his cheek. With that awkwardness addressed, I returned to the presentation. Now, let's discuss the organizational changes that will begin immediately. I clicked to the next slide, revealing a restructured leadership chart. Derek's name was notably absent from his previous position, as were those of Marcus, Vince, and 2 other executives who had been central to undermining Meridian's values. As you can see, we're implementing significant changes to align our leadership with our recommitment to founding principles. Vanessa Liu will be stepping into the role of Chief Operations Officer. Vanessa rose from her seat at the table, her confident posture a stark contrast to her previously understated presence in executive meetings. Like me, she had downplayed her authority while documenting the cultural issues at Meridian. Additionally, Dr. Ananya Patel will be joining us as Chief Technology Officer, leading our renewed commitment to ethical innovation. Marcus made a small, involuntary sound of protest. Dr. Patel was the candidate he had dismissed as a diversity hire, despite her impeccable qualifications. These changes are effective immediately, I continued, as are several departures from our executive team. The room went utterly still. Derek's eyes were fixed on me now, the reality of his situation beginning to dawn on him fully. Following, extensive documentation of policy violations, misalignment with company values, and in some cases, ethical breaches. The following individuals will be transitioning out of Meridian, effective today. The screen displayed the names: Derek Collins, Marcus Peterson, Vincent Lawson, Gregory Thomas, and Philip Warren, the core group who had been systematically undermining Meridian's mission. Each of these transitions will be handled professionally, with appropriate severance per their employment agreements, contingent upon cooperation with our compliance team's ongoing investigation. Derek half rose from his seat, then seemed to think better of it as security personnel discreetly entered the room, positioning themselves near the doors, a precaution I had arranged in case emotions ran too high. "This is," Derek began, his voice strained. "This is a business decision based on extensive documentation," I interrupted smoothly. "Documentation that will be reviewed in individual exit interviews immediately following this meeting." I clicked to the next slide, shifting focus from the departures to the path forward. Now, let's discuss Meridian's recommitment to its founding principles, beginning with the Palmer Technologies acquisition. For the next 20 minutes, I outlined the vision for Meridian's future, a return to the values-driven innovation that had made us an industry leader, with specific initiatives to strengthen our ethical framework, environmental commitment, and inclusive culture. Throughout this presentation, I maintained the confident posture and authoritative tone of a CEO addressing her leadership team. Nothing like the careful deference I had displayed as Derek's wife. The physical transformation was complete. In my tailored suit, with my direct gaze and commanding presence, I had fully stepped into my power as Elena Chambers, founder and CEO. As I concluded the formal presentation, I opened the floor for questions, knowing there would be many. The board members and remaining executives raised thoughtful points about implementation timelines and communication strategies, the expected concerns during a significant transition. Derek, Marcus, and Vince remained silent, their expressions cycling through shock, anger, and calculation as they processed the implications of what had just occurred. Their silence spoke volumes. They understood that any objections would only dig their professional graves deeper. When the question period ended, I made one final announcement. Security will escort those transitioning out of the company to private meetings with HR and legal representatives. The rest of you, please remain for a strategic planning session regarding immediate next steps. As security personnel moved toward Derek and the others, I allowed myself one final moment of eye contact with the man I had married. The man who had dismissed me as unambitious, unimportant, and unintelligent for 3 years. In that brief exchange, I saw the dawning comprehension of exactly who I was, and always had been. Not just his boss, but a strategic thinker who had patiently gathered evidence while he unknowingly built the case against himself. Not just a founder, but a visionary who had created something he had tried to diminish. Not just a woman, but a leader who had watched and waited for precisely the right moment to reclaim her power. The power shift was complete. As Derek was escorted from the room, his shoulders slumped in defeat, I turned back to the remaining leadership team, my team. "Now, openly and officially. Now," I said, "let's rebuild Meridian together." As security escorted Derek, Marcus, and Vince toward the door, Derek suddenly stopped, turning to face the room. His face had transformed from shock to a tightly controlled anger that I recognized from our rare but significant arguments at home. "I'd like a word with my wife," he said, his voice strained with forced calm. Privately, the room fell silent again, all eyes moving between us, the professional tension now layered with personal drama. I considered refusing, directing security to continue the escort. That would have been within my rights as CEO, but there was a necessary confrontation here, one that couldn't be entirely delegated to HR representatives. 5 minutes, I said, nodding to the security team. "In the adjacent office, please." Richardson looked concerned. "Elena, are you certain?" "I'm certain," I replied with a reassuring nod. Please continue the meeting. I'll rejoin shortly. I followed Derek and a security officer into the glass-walled meeting room next door. The security officer positioned himself discreetly by the door, while Derek and I faced each other across a small conference table, a physical barrier between us that seemed appropriate given the circumstances. For several seconds, Derek simply stared at me, as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with the wife he thought he knew. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and tight with anger. 3 years, he said. 3 years of marriage, and this entire time you've been… What? Spying on me? Using me to infiltrate my own company? Not your company, Derek, I corrected, calmly. My company. And I wasn't spying. I was observing. There's an important distinction. A distinction without a difference, he snapped. You lied to me. About everything. About everything. I tilted my head slightly, considering his accusation. Did I? When we met, I told you I had left corporate work to pursue more meaningful projects. That was true. I told you I cared deeply about ethical business practices and sustainability. Also true. What I didn't share was that I owned Meridian. But then, you never actually asked about my past achievements. You were too busy telling me about yours. His face flushed darker. Don't try to justify this. You deliberately deceived me. You married me under false pretenses. False pretenses? I repeated, keeping my voice even. Derek, I married you because I genuinely saw potential in you. I admired your stated commitment to Meridian's mission. You spoke so passionately about ethical innovation and inclusive leadership. I thought we shared values. And this is how you express that admiration? By humiliating me in front of the entire executive team? I leaned forward slightly, meeting his gaze directly. No, Derek. You humiliated yourself through your actions. The mockery of diversity hires, the undermining of female colleagues, the systematic dismantling of sustainability initiatives, the condescension toward anyone you deemed beneath you, including your wife. I watched the impact of each example hit him, his eyes widening slightly as he realized just how much I had witnessed. Did you ever actually care about me? He asked. And for a brief moment, I glimpsed genuine hurt beneath the anger. Or was I just a convenient access point? The question gave me pause. Despite everything, it deserved an honest answer. When we met, I cared about what you appeared to be. A man who believed in Meridian's mission as much as I did. And yes, I grew to care for you as a husband, despite your increasingly dismissive attitude. But you never actually knew me, Derek. You never tried to. The woman you married, the quiet, supportive wife who knew her place, she was only one small facet of who I am, a role I played while watching you become someone I couldn't respect. So this whole marriage was just an elaborate corporate espionage operation, he said bitterly. No, I replied firmly. It was a genuine relationship that revealed your true character over time. The Derek Collins I married talked about making technology that improved people's lives. The Derek Collins being escorted from Meridian today called Sustainability Social Responsibility Theater and actively worked to dismantle the ethical foundations of my company. He winced at having his words quoted back to him, no doubt remembering the context in which he'd said them. Those recordings, he said, realization dawning. The home security system you insisted on upgrading last year. You've been monitoring our house? Legal and disclosed in the security contract you signed, I confirmed. Though I doubt you read the details. You rarely do, as your hasty approval of the Palmer integration plan demonstrated. His eyes narrowed. You went through my work laptop. No, need. I have access to the entire Meridian server system. I founded the company, remember? But your shadow implementation plan for Palmer was particularly illuminating, especially the parts about dismantling their environmental technology division, while maintaining green messaging for PR purposes. Derek's face went pale again as he realized the extent of my knowledge. The Palmer deal. You're the one who pushed for that acquisition in the first place, aren't you? Not Richardson. Yes. Palmer's environmental monitoring technology represents the future of responsible industry, a future you and your colleagues were planning to sacrifice for short-term profit. He shook his head, anger returning. You don't understand the market realities. Those environmental initiatives would take years to become profitable. I understand market realities perfectly, I interrupted, my voice taking on the edge I reserved for particularly obtuse business arguments. I built Meridian from nothing into an industry leader while maintaining ethical standards most companies wouldn't attempt. What you call market realities are simply compromises you're willing to make for quarterly bonuses. His mouth opened, then closed, no counter-argument. Forthcoming, the dynamic between us had shifted irrevocably, his presumed authority completely undermined by the reality of who I actually was. What happens now? He finally asked, defeat creeping into his voice. Professionally, you'll meet with HR and legal representatives. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately, with severance contingent upon your cooperation with our ongoing compliance investigation. Your company assets, laptop, phone, access cards, will be collected before you leave the building. Standard procedure for executive transitions. I delivered this information in the same tone I would use with any departing executive, maintaining professional distance despite our personal connection. And personally, he pressed. I softened my voice slightly, acknowledging the human impact beneath the corporate situation. Personally, Derek, our marriage is over. I've arranged for your belongings to be packed and delivered to your mother's address, the one you listed as your emergency contact. The locks at our home have already been changed. You can't just— I can and I have, I said firmly. The prenuptial agreement you insisted upon makes the division of assets quite straightforward. The house is mine, purchased before our marriage, through one of my holding companies. Most of the artwork and furnishings as well. You'll retain your personal effects, your car, and your non-Meridian investments. I paused, then added, I've also arranged for a separate bank account to be established in your name with 6 months of living expenses, as a courtesy. More than fair, given the circumstances. Derek stared at me, seemingly struggling to process how completely his life had changed in the span of 30 minutes. The man who had left our house this morning confident in his professional standing and his marital dynamic now faced unemployment and divorce simultaneously. Was any of it real? He asked quietly. Any moment in our marriage? The question held genuine pain, and despite everything, I found myself answering honestly. Yes, Derek. Many moments were real. I did care for you. I did hope you would grow into the man you presented yourself to be when we met. But you chose a different path, professionally and personally. You became someone who mocked his wife's intelligence behind her back, who undermined female colleagues, who planned to dismantle environmental initiatives for profit. Those choices had consequences. Today is simply when those consequences arrived. Our 5 minutes were nearly up. Security shifted slightly by the door, a subtle reminder of the business still to be conducted. One more thing, I said, reaching into my portfolio to retrieve a sealed envelope. This explains everything in more detail. My reasoning, the documentation, what you can expect moving forward. I prepared it yesterday, knowing this conversation would be too brief for a complete explanation. He took the envelope mechanically, looking down at his name written in my familiar handwriting, the same handwriting that had signed grocery lists and birthday cards throughout our marriage. Your personal items will be delivered by 5 p.m. today, I continued, bringing the conversation to its necessary conclusion. If anything is missing, you can contact Josephine Rivera in legal. She'll serve as the intermediary for any further communication between us. Derek looked up from the envelope, his expression unreadable. You've thought of everything, haven't you? Yes, I said simply. That's who I've always been. I nodded to the security officer who stepped forward. "Mr. Collins, if you'll come with me now." Derek stood slowly, the envelope clutched in his hand. At the door, he paused for one final look. Not at me, but at the conference room across the hall where the board and remaining executives continued their meeting without him. His gaze held a mixture of anger, humiliation, and dawning comprehension of exactly how much he had lost. Then he turned and followed the security officer toward the elevator and out of my company and my life. I allowed myself exactly 30 seconds to acknowledge the complex emotions of the moment. 3 years of marriage ended in a 5-minute conversation. A relationship built on partial truths from both sides, now severed with clinical precision. Then I straightened my shoulders, checked my reflection in the glass wall to ensure my professional composure remained intact, and returned to the conference room to continue rebuilding the company I had founded, no longer from the shadows, but from the head of the table where I had always belonged. As I re-entered the room, all conversation paused briefly. I could see the questions in their eyes, curiosity about what had transpired in that private confrontation, concern about how personal drama might affect professional transition. "Now," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table, "let's continue with our restructuring plan. Vanessa, would you walk us through the first phase of implementation?" The meeting resumed seamlessly, the momentary disruption already fading as we focused on Meridian's future. The revelation was complete. The confrontation was over. It was time to move forward. The remainder of that momentous day unfolded with the precision of a well-orchestrated symphony. After the leadership meeting concluded, I moved to my new office, actually my original office, though I had never physically occupied it before. The spacious corner suite had been maintained for EC Holdings representatives throughout Richardson's tenure as CEO, used primarily for board meetings and confidential discussions. Now, as I settled behind the desk that was rightfully mine, Vanessa brought me the first reports of the consequences already rippling through Meridian. "Derek's exit interview was interesting," she said, placing a tablet on my desk with the HR summary. "He vacillated between anger and bargaining, tried to argue that his strategy for Palmer Technologies was actually aligned with our long-term interests, just pragmatically implemented." I scanned the notes, noting how specifically Derek had tried to justify each documented violation as a misunderstanding or necessary business compromise. His arguments might have been convincing to someone who hadn't witnessed his private conversations about dismantling Palmer's environmental division. "And the others?" I asked. Marcus went straight to threats. Legal action, reputation damage, the usual bluster. Legal shut that down quickly with the recording of him discussing how to prevent diversity candidates from advancing beyond middle management. I nodded, unsurprised. Marcus had always resorted to intimidation when challenged. Vince mostly seemed shell-shocked, Vanessa continued. When shown the evidence about his expense account manipulation, he became very cooperative. Apparently, he's worried about potential criminal implications. And he should be, I noted, though we're handling it internally for now, contingent on his full cooperation with the audit team. The consequences extended far beyond these individual exits. By mid-afternoon, the company-wide announcement of my identity and the leadership restructuring had generated a tsunami of reactions throughout Meridian. The all-hands broadcast had been witnessed by over 2,000 employees across our global offices. The shocked expressions, gasps, and occasional spontaneous applause had been visible in the video feeds from our largest locations. Social media was ablaze with speculation and commentary, ranging from support for the "boss reveals herself" narrative to concern about the stability of Meridian's leadership. By 3 p.m., I had conducted my first press interview as Elena Chambers, CEO, carefully explaining our recommitment to founding principles without directly addressing the personal aspect of Derek's termination. The business media was fascinated by the story of the secret founder finally stepping into the public eye, though most respected my refusal to discuss my marriage as part of the corporate narrative. "The Palmer Technologies team is thrilled," Josephine reported, joining Vanessa in my office with her own update. Their CEO called personally to express relief that their environmental innovations will remain central to the integration plan. They were apparently quite concerned about rumors they'd heard regarding potential dismantling of their core technology. "I'm not surprised," I replied. Derek wasn't exactly subtle in his discussions with their executive team. "Schedule a personal meeting with their leadership for next week. I want to reassure them directly." My phone buzzed with a notification. Derek had been escorted from the building 30 minutes ago, his company credentials and devices collected. According to security, he had maintained rigid composure until reaching the lobby, where he'd finally shown visible emotion. Not sadness, but rage so intense that security had briefly considered intervention before he'd regained control and walked out into the afternoon sunshine. I felt a complex mix of emotions about his departure. Not regret exactly, but acknowledgement of the personal cost of today's necessary actions. 3 years of marriage ended with clinical efficiency, a relationship sacrificed for the greater good of the company and its mission. "Elena?" Vanessa's voice pulled me back to the present. "The senior team is assembled for the 4 o'clock briefing, and Dr. Patel has arrived for her onboarding as CTO. I nodded, setting aside personal reflections for later processing. "Excellent. Let's make sure her integration is seamless. The technology team needs strong leadership after today's disruption." The afternoon blurred into evening as we moved through the carefully planned transition sequence. Each hour brought new developments. At 4 p.m., I met with the remaining senior leadership, outlining our path forward and addressing their understandable concerns about stability during this dramatic transition. At 5 p.m., I received confirmation that Derek's personal belongings had been delivered to his mother's home as arranged. The security team reported that he had not attempted to return to our house, where the locks and security codes had already been changed. At 6 p.m., the first wave of press coverage hit major business publications, with headlines ranging from "Meridian founder emerges in dramatic leadership shakeup" to "Secret CEO reveals identity, restructures executive team." Most focused on the business aspects, though a few tabloids had already begun speculating about the personal implications of firing one's husband. At 7 p.m., I conducted a video call with Palmer Technologies leadership, personally assuring them that their environmental innovation would remain central to our integration strategy, exactly the opposite of what Derek had been planning. Throughout these hours, I maintained the composed, authoritative presence expected of a CEO navigating a major transition. Only after the last meeting concluded, the last call ended, and the offices emptied for the night, did I allow myself a moment of private reflection. Standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the CEO's office, my office now, I watched the city lights shimmer in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Derek was confronting the consequences of his actions, both professional and personal. His career at Meridian was over. His reputation in the industry would be significantly damaged once the full story emerged. His marriage had ended in a 5-minute conversation that would undoubtedly replay in his mind for years to come. Was it worth it? Not the personal satisfaction of seeing his shock when Richardson introduced me, though I couldn't deny that had been momentarily gratifying, but the larger upheaval of Meridian's leadership and my own life. The answer came easily as I reviewed what had been at stake: Palmer's environmental technology that could revolutionize industrial sustainability, the careers of countless employees like Dr. Patel who had been systematically marginalized, the foundational values of Meridian itself, which had been steadily eroded under the influence of Derek and his colleagues. Yes, it had been worth it. Sometimes justice requires disruption. Sometimes reclaiming what matters means dismantling what stands in the way. My phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. Just saw the WSJ headline: Meridian's founder reclaims company vision after years in shadows. Perfect summary. I smiled, tucking the phone away and turning from the window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, integrating the restructured leadership team, refocusing our strategic priorities, beginning the careful work of cultural rehabilitation throughout the organization. But tonight, as I gathered my things to leave the office, to return not to the house I'd shared with Derek but to the apartment I'd maintained throughout our marriage, I felt a profound sense of alignment. Elena Chambers, founder and CEO of Meridian Innovations, was no longer a secret identity or a shadow presence. She was simply me, stepping fully into the light. 3 weeks later, I sat across from Josephine in my office, reviewing the final separation agreement. Derek had eventually accepted the terms, generous by any objective standard, after his initial threats of protracted legal battles faded in the face of our overwhelming documentation. He's taken a position with Westfield Tech, Josephine mentioned, referencing a smaller competitor. Junior VP role, significant step down from his position here. Apparently, the married to the secret CEO story made a lot of companies hesitant to hire him, despite his experience. I nodded, unsurprised. The business world loved gossip, and Derek's humiliation had become something of a cautionary tale in executive circles. And the others? I asked. Marcus is still unemployed, threatening. Various legal actions that will go nowhere. Vince took a position 3 levels down from his previous role at a startup. The others have largely kept low profiles during their transitions. I signed the final page of the agreement, officially ending my marriage. And Meridian? Josephine's expression brightened. The Palmer integration is proceeding better than projected. Dr. Patel has already implemented 2 significant improvements to their environmental monitoring technology. Employee satisfaction scores are up 15% in just 3 weeks, and the market has responded positively to our recommitment to founding principles. And the dramatic leadership transition? I asked, quoting a particularly breathless headline from the business press. Old news already, Josephine smiled. You're just Elena Chambers now, CEO of Meridian Innovations. The secret founder and underestimated wife angles have largely faded from coverage. As she gathered the signed documents and left, I turned to my computer to review Dr. Patel's latest innovation proposal. Exactly the kind of ethically grounded, forward-thinking technology development that had inspired me to found Meridian in the first place. My phone buzzed with a calendar alert. Palmer Technologies Integration Review, 2 p.m. The meeting that Derek had once hoped to lead, where he had planned to begin dismantling Palmer's environmental division while maintaining green messaging, for PR purposes. Instead, that meeting would now focus on accelerating Palmer's environmental innovations and integrating them throughout Meridian's product line, true to our founding mission of technology that served humanity's best interests. Sometimes, justice arrives in unexpected ways. Sometimes the person dismissed as unambitious or unintelligent is actually the one with the clearest vision and strongest principles. Sometimes the boring housewife is actually the founder and CEO, quietly observing until the perfect moment, to reclaim what matters most. That perfect moment had arrived, and Meridian, my company, my vision, my legacy, was back on the path I had always intended for it. And Derek? He would eventually recover professionally, though never to his previous level. He would likely remarry someday, perhaps to someone who truly was content with the limited role he preferred for a wife. And perhaps, if he was capable of genuine reflection, he might occasionally remember the woman he had so thoroughly underestimated, the boring housewife, who turned out to be the most consequential person he would ever meet. But that was his journey now, not mine. My focus had returned to where it belonged, leading Meridian Innovations toward a future where technology served humanity's highest potential, guided by principles of integrity, inclusion, and environmental responsibility. Exactly. as I had envisioned from the beginning.